Prior to 1990, I led a relatively normal life, with just minding my own business, teaching accounting courses at a local university, and I was a certified public accountant, not practicing at the time, but just teaching accounting courses. Had two very active teenage daughters, happily married, and attending Southern Baptist Church and doing a lot of school and community activities. Never really thought about the UFO subject until July of 1990. I took a weekend's break and went up to my parents' house for a visit, and my mother and I were sitting at her kitchen table just eating breakfast and talking about everyday things, when my mother read an article in the newspaper, her local newspaper, that stated that the Russian government had just admitted the existence of UFOs. And we started talking about whether extraterrestrials could exist, and my mother said that she just didn't believe that there were any entities other than us. And I started debating the issue. And then I remembered that my brother and a friend and I saw a spacecraft when we were all children. And I asked my mother if she remembered that day, and she said, yeah, I do, but I think probably what you saw was a weather balloon or a satellite or something like that. Well, my mother didn't see the object, so she said, well, your brother's coming over for a visit in a little while. I'll just ask him if he remembers seeing anything that day. Well, my brother soon came into the kitchen too, and I said to him, Seth, do you remember seeing that object that we thought was a flying saucer when we were kids? And he said, oh yeah, how could I ever forget that? And so I asked him what he remembered about that day, and he remembered the same thing I did. He remembered seeing an object that was silver in color, spherical in shape. It was sitting stationary in the sky to the north of us, and it sat there for a long time. It was in the afternoon. The sky was blue, white clouds, a sunny day, and every once in a while the sun would shine on the object such that it looked bluish, sometimes bluish in color, most of the time silver. We watched it for a long time, and then it looked as if it floated down into the woods nearby to the east, and we went and looked for the object. We thought that we'd like to see if it was a spaceship. We called them flying saucers back then. It was a long time ago. But we went into the woods looking for the object and came back out very disappointed that we hadn't found it. When I remembered this incident in 1990, my brother and I commented on how unusual it was, how strange it was that we never talked about it. For 30 years, we never talked about that incident, yet looking back, it seemed to be one of the most important days in our lives. But then I asked my brother if he thought what we had seen that day really was a spaceship. And he said yes. And I said, why do you think so? And he said, well, I've seen quite a few TV shows about spaceships and extraterrestrials, and read a lot of books on the subject. And he said, in fact, I've seen some talk shows wherein their people claim to have been abducted. And he said in some cases they remember the incidents as dreams, but then they undergo hypnotic regression, and they discover that the incident was real, and that there are more details they remember under hypnosis that they could not remember consciously. When he said the word dream, I remembered an incident that occurred to me in the late 70s or early 80s. I lived in Florence, Alabama at that time, and one morning I woke up and walked into the kitchen to get a drink of water, and remembered that during the night I had been aboard a spacecraft. How I knew it was a spacecraft, I don't know. I didn't know then how I knew that, but I knew that I was in a round room that was extremely bright, and I remembered chalky colored creatures with big, huge, black, almond-shaped eyes performing medical procedures on me. I couldn't remember what kind of procedures they performed. I just remembered that it was done. And when I remembered that, I thought, oh, wait a minute, this had to have been a dream. There's no way in the world that entities could get in the house, and there's no way that a spaceship could get in the neighborhood without all the neighbors seeing it, and there's no way that I could have gotten out of the bedroom without my husband waking up and discovering my being gone. So this could not have happened. It had to have been a dream. There's no other logical explanation for it. I never heard about abductions back then in the 70s or 80s, so I didn't know they occurred. So then I said to myself, though, but why does this seem so real? It didn't seem like a dream. It seemed that I was really there in this round room with entities all around me performing medical exam. Why does it seem so real if it wasn't? But then I thought again, well, no, it can't be real. It's impossible. Things like this just don't happen. And then I thought, well, the entities couldn't get into the house. All the doors and windows are locked. And then I thought, well, they are locked, aren't they? Just maybe this did happen and a door window wasn't locked. So I walked around the house and physically checked all the doors and windows, and they were indeed locked. So I told myself that it had to have been a dream. It's the only thing it could have been, that things like that just couldn't happen. And I convinced myself that it was a dream and was able to forget about it until July 1990 when my brother and I had this conversation at my parents' kitchen table. And I sat there for a few minutes trying to decide whether I should tell my brother about this dream or not. And I finally mustered up the courage to do so. I don't know why I hesitated. If it had been just a dream, why should I have hesitated to tell anyone about it? But there was always something about that felt real. Finally, I did muster up the courage to tell my brother about the dream, and as I told him about it, I noticed that my mother was turning white as a ghost, and the more I spoke, the whiter she turned and had a shocked expression on her face. And my brother's eyebrow shot up, and he kind of got a crooked smile on his face. And finally I said to them, why are you two looking at me like that? Do you think I've gone crazy? What does this expression mean? My mother didn't answer, and my brother finally said, well, we read communion, and what you're describing here is just like what we've read. And he said, what you're describing is what I've heard people talk about on TV. He said, I don't think what happened to you was a dream. It sounds real to me. Well, I started thinking about that and told my brother that I had to find out whether the incident was real or a dream. I had to know. I just had to know. My mother begged me to drop the idea, not to pursue finding out whether it was a dream or not. And I went back home. I lived in Mississippi at the time, and came back home and decided that I would take my mother's advice, that I would just not worry with pursuing the idea of whether this was real or not. Besides, I was too busy to mess with it at the time, I thought. I was attending graduate school, working on my master's in business administration, working full-time, had 2 active teenagers, and had just started having a house built. So I didn't have time to mess with nonsense like that, I thought. But all of a sudden, the idea of my having been abducted, of this incident having been real, these ideas just wouldn't go out of my head. And to make it worse, I started having flashbacks of seeing these chalky colored creatures with big black eyes. Every time I would look in the mirror to put on my makeup or brush my hair or brush my teeth, I would see visions of these entities staring back at me, and I couldn't get it out of my head. And I started being afraid. I thought, if this happened to me, if it really did happen to me, what if it happens again? What if they come back? What if they're hiding in my house when I go to bed at night? And I got scared. I started looking under the beds and in the closets and all the rooms before I go to bed at night. But on the other hand, I would tell myself, well, you know, if it did happen, if it was real, you're okay. There's nothing wrong. They didn't hurt you. So my curiosity outweighed my fear. And I decided that I had to find out whether this encounter was real or not. I put it off for a while. And then finally, I called my brother and asked him if he could give me the name of someone who could help me determine whether my so-called dream was actually a dream or a real event. He put me in touch with Bud Hopkins. He gave me Bud Hopkins' name and address. I wrote to Bud, and it was several months before I got a response. In the meantime, I noticed some odd things started happening to me. I started being followed by cars, white sedans, dark blue sedans. Sometimes it seemed that cars were following me that were of other colors, and this unnerved me somewhat. I didn't know why all of a sudden I was being followed. I noticed that I started having odd noises on my telephone, sometimes music, sometimes beeping sounds, sometimes buzzing in the background. Sometimes it sounded as if a cassette tape were winding around in a cassette recorder. Sometimes I would hear voices over the line. I'd never had those things occur before I wrote to Bud Hopkins asking for help. And I never had these things happen before I discussed this possible abduction with anyone. I discussed it with a couple of other people in addition to writing Bud Hopkins a letter. Another thing that happened to me that I thought was very odd is I came home from work one day and discovered that the locks on the exterior doors were loose. That upset me somewhat, and I couldn't understand why these things started happening all of a sudden when I decided to examine the possibility of my so-called dream being a real event. Another odd thing that happened was in October of 1990, I woke up one morning above my bed, not in it, and I felt that I was awake, that it was really something that happened, that it wasn't a dream, but I had no explanation for it. I also remembered being in a beam of light. I was lying horizontally in a beam of light. But after it happened, I thought, this is weird. Something's wrong with me. I'm going crazy. Things like this just can't happen. Not too long after that, I got some information from Bud Hopkins. There was one article or one little publication that talked about the pros and cons of hypnotic regression to examine whether a person has had alien abductions or not. And then there was another little bulletin that he sent that seemed to be a series of articles written by researchers. Well, I tossed that one aside and didn't read it immediately. And it was a couple of months later that I finally read it. And when I did read it, I noticed an article in there about an abductee, an alien abductee, lying above her bed and dropping down onto her waterbed. And when I read that, I just about went berserk because I thought, gosh, this woman is an alien abductee and she's had an encounter like the experience I remembered a couple of months ago. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back. When I read that article and realized that somebody besides myself was hovering above the bed, I had to, at that point in time, find out whether I had actually been abducted by aliens or not. So, I noticed at the top of the information Bud Hopkins sent me, there was a name, address, and phone number of a researcher that Bud Hopkins told me to get in touch with in his note. And the man's name was John Carpenter. He is now the Director of Abduction Research for the Mutual UFO Network. And I called him and told him what I've just said, told him everything that had happened to me that I remembered, and asked him if he could help me find out whether or not this incident I recalled was a dream, or whether it was a real event, or whether I was just going crazy. When I found out he was a psychotherapist, that convinced me that I should go see him. I really thought that perhaps I had gone insane, and I was having all these weird flashbacks of alien creatures, and I thought maybe I'm just paranoid about people following me, so I thought maybe I was crazy. Whatever the answer was, I wanted to find out whether my incident I recalled was a dream, or whether it was a real event, or whether I was going crazy. I wanted to know so I could deal with the problem as it needed to be dealt with. So I made an appointment with John Carpenter to go to him for hypnotic regression. Set up an appointment, the first one in March 1991. My brother rode to Missouri with me, rode to Springfield, Missouri with me, and on my first visit to Springfield, Missouri, had 2 hypnosis sessions. In the first session, I examined the memory of the childhood sighting where my brother and I saw the UFO, and we went looking for it in the woods. Well, under regression, I remembered that as soon as we got into the woods, we split up. And I remembered that I went off to the right, and I was walking through the woods looking for this flying saucer that we thought had landed there. But I didn't find the flying saucer. What I saw was a chalky-colored creature standing in front of a big tree. And I remembered in the hypnosis session being frightened when I saw him. And I remembered that with his big black eyes, he talked to me and told me not to be afraid. And I remembered he took me by the hand, and there's a lapse in memory at that point. The next thing I remembered was being in a different part of the woods, and in a clearing I could see this spaceship, this spherical spaceship, just hovering above the ground. And I remembered that a beam of white light just came down upon the entity and me, beamed us somehow aboard the craft. I remember being in the light, and then the next memory I have is being aboard the craft, lying on a platform with other entities, the same height, same shape. They looked identical to the one I saw in the woods. They were standing around me, poking my arms and legs. And then the next thing I remembered about that incident was being back at the edge of the woods, joining the others, and we all walked out of the woods disappointed we hadn't seen anything. I didn't remember seeing anything. In the second hypnosis session, we examined what I called a dream that happened when I was an adult, of being in a round room, having medical exams performed on me. We explored that, and I remembered additional details about that incident. Under regression, I remembered that I walked out of the house myself. Something compelled me to walk out the door and around into the backyard. And in the backyard, I saw the spherical object hovering in the air. And again, a beam of white light took me aboard, and I lay on a platform while identical-looking creatures performed gynecological type procedures on me. I remembered that some tissue samples were taken from the vaginal area. I remembered that a needle was inserted through the abdominal wall into the ovary and ova extracted. And I remembered that there was one entity on the other side of the room who was doing something with what was very similar to test tubes. I don't remember a whole lot other than, I remembered something being done to my right ear. I felt what seemed to be a piercing sensation and pain in 2 places, right behind my ear and deep inside my ear. And I believe that's all I could recall even under regression, about the first incident. Well, when I came out of hypnosis, I denied being hypnotized. At that point in time, I wanted John Carpenter to tell me I was crazy. I felt that it would be easier to feel that I was insane, easier for me to believe that I was mentally ill, so I could just be put into a mental institution, get proper treatment, get well, and have all of this abduction, this feeling of abductions out of my mind. I wanted somebody to tell me I was crazy and help me get well, so I wouldn't see these chalky colored creatures when I looked in the mirror anymore. So I wouldn't feel that I was being followed and being watched all the time. But John Carpenter didn't cooperate with me. He said, I think that you're suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder because you've had some traumatic things, very traumatic things happen to you, but you're not crazy. I denied being hypnotized. I said, well, you know, maybe I wasn't hypnotized. Maybe what I remembered didn't really happen and I imagined it, so I wasn't hypnotized. But my brother said it was obvious that you were. It was quite obvious. I could see the pain you were going through. I could tell that you were reliving things by the expressions on your faces. On your face. So John and my brother tried hard to convince me that what I'd remembered was real, but I didn't want to accept it. I wanted to deny that these things could happen because they didn't fit in with my reality. You know, I didn't learn about ETs or any other kind of entity in my church, in my school, or anywhere else. So I didn't know how to fit the reality of these things happening into my life. So I chose to deny it for a while. Anyway, for a solid week I was in shock and going through denial and was so confused. And at the same time, I kept thinking to myself, well, if these incidents did happen, I want them to happen again. I want these entities to come back because I want to learn about them. I want to know where they're from. I want to know if they're like us. I want to know why they did what they did. I want answers, and I want them right now. So despite the fact that I'm a little bit afraid, I want them to come back so I can find out what's going on, if this really is occurring. Well, I had the leisure of going through this turmoil for several days, but the first day back at work, I was on spring break, week's spring break, when I went to John for my first hypnosis sessions, and so got back home on a Tuesday, and for the remainder of the week I walked around in shock. But on Monday morning I had to go back to work, and I managed to get through the morning okay. But then at lunchtime, and everybody left the building where I worked. I taught at a university, and at lunchtime the whole building shut down. We had no classes from noon until 1 o'clock in the building where I worked, and everybody left for lunch, and I did the same thing. And I ran through a drive-through, got a cheeseburger, came back to work, and decided I would grade papers while everyone else was gone, and then I could get a lot done. But as soon as I got my cheeseburger, came back into the building, something compelled me to go to my car and get a letter that I had left in there. And so when I walked outside, I noticed that there was a man snooping around my car. I got a real good look at him. He had on a long-sleeve blue Oxford cloth shirt and gray slacks. He wore glasses. He had on a tie, and he was messing around my car. And I stood there for a few minutes and thought, what's this guy doing? Is he about to steal my car? And I don't know what a car thief looks like, but my mind said, well, he's not a car thief. He's dressed too nicely to be a car thief. And what is it that he's doing? Well, in a few seconds, he caught sight of me, and he looked at me, and then he walked around my car and started looking as if he was poking around in the grass. And I thought, okay, now what do I do? Do I go to my car and get this letter out, or do I go back inside the building and call security? What do I do? Well, what I did was just walk onto the car and kept my eyes on him the whole time, and he was looking at me out of the corner of his eye the entire time I was walking to my car. And finally I got there, unlocked the door, and jumped inside and locked it real quickly, and he and I were playing this cat and mouse game. I'd watch him, he'd watch me, and he acted as if he were poking around in the grass at something. And then I noticed there was a truck parked in front of my car. And I looked at it and thought, that truck must belong to that man. So I started memorizing the license plate. And as soon as I did, that man just ran as fast as he could move, jumped in his truck, threw this little tool in the back of it, and sped off. But I'd already memorized the license plate number. I was able to trace it and got the name and address of the man who was snooping around my car. And it took me a couple of months, but I eventually was able to pull some strings and find out who the man is and where he works. And he works for a company that does contract work for NASA. And the company he works for is responsible for calibrating the equipment related to the space shuttle's external tanks. And in the meantime, before I got that information, there were some other strange things that happened to me. I moved into my new house that I had built, and I came home from work one day and found the exterior doors had been loosened in my new home. We had an elaborate security system put into the house, and it kept malfunctioning. And the security people came out practically daily for a couple of months and were extremely exasperated because they couldn't figure out why the memory in my security system was being erased. And also, my husband came home from work one day and told me that the FBI was snooping around the hospital where he worked, asking questions about him. One of the employees told him about it. So I started thinking about this. I thought, okay, now, why all of a sudden is the FBI interested in my husband? And why did this man who works for a company that does subcontract work for NASA messing around my car, just all of a sudden, right after I have had hypnosis sessions about abductions by extraterrestrials? Well, I started thinking, okay, this phenomenon must be real. I must have been abducted, because I can't see any other reason why these other strange things would be happening. And I must not be insane. The FBI wouldn't be interested in my insanity. The man who worked for a company that does contract work for NASA would not be interested in my insanity, but would they possibly be interested in my contact with extraterrestrials or whatever beings these are? Yes, that made sense. That made sense. That's the point in time where I started accepting the reality of my encounters. Another incident that helped confirm the reality of my experiences was an invitation to view the Space Shuttle Endeavour. One night I was teaching an accounting course at the local Air Force base. The university where I taught had a contract to teach X amount of courses at the Air Force base, and I was teaching one of the accounting courses out there. And the last night of lectures, the week before final exams, I was giving a lecture in accounting, and at the end of the night, when all the students were leaving, one of my adult female students approached my desk and handed me something. And she said to me, my husband said to give this to you. And I looked at what she gave me, and it looked like some kind of a patch, and I said, what is this? And she said, it's a patch of the Space Shuttle Endeavour. And I said, okay, why did your husband send this to me? And she said, I don't know, he just told me to give it to you. Well, and I started driving home, and I thought, what does this mean? This is a message of some kind. Why is this woman's husband, who I later learned was a captain in the Air Force, why was he sending me a patch of the Space Shuttle Endeavour? So when I got home that night, I looked up the phone number of this woman, and I called her husband and said, thank you for sending me the patch of the Space Shuttle Endeavour, but I'm rather curious, why did you do it? And he said to me, well, my wife has enjoyed your accounting class so much, I just wanted to give you a token of our appreciation. And I was thinking in my head, this is a bunch of garbage. This woman does not like my accounting course that much, this doesn't make sense. But he went on to say that to further show their appreciation, he would like to take me to see the Space Shuttle Endeavour when it arrived on base the next time. And the whole time I talked with him, I thought, what's going on here? I don't understand this. This sounds very strange. Why would an accounting instructor get a special invitation to view the space shuttle? And I hung up thanking him again, and then told him that I appreciated his invitation, and when I hung up, I hoped I would never hear from him again. However, the next week he called the night before I was to give a final exam out on base, and he said, the Space Shuttle Endeavour is going to be on base tomorrow. I'd like to take you to see it. And he said, now don't tell anyone that this invitation is being extended to you. Don't tell anyone you're going out there. This invitation is for you alone. And make sure you bring your camera. I'll make sure that you get some excellent pictures of this shuttle. Well, I thought that this was a setup, and it frightened me a lot. And I was too scared to go out there. So and I made up some excuses. I told him, well, actually I told him the truth. I was tied up giving final exams the next day. I didn't have time to go look at it. But even if I'd had time, I wouldn't have gone. I was too frightened. So anyway, I went out to the base the next night, and I just had a weird feeling that something was wrong. And I was afraid to go on base, so I didn't drive my own car. I hitched a ride with one of my students, and went in to give my final exam. And while I was sitting there giving the final exam, at one point in time I looked up and saw through the door in the back of the room a man in an Air Force blue uniform, and he motioned for me to come out into the hall. And I did, and I looked at his name badge and noticed that this was the name of the man who had called me to invite me to go out and view the shuttle. So when I walked out into the hall and saw his name, he didn't even greet me. He said to me, let's go right now. And I said, go where? He said, to see the space shuttle. I told you I'd take you to see the space shuttle, let's go. And I said, I can't leave my students here, they're taking a final exam. He said, oh, they won't care. Besides, this will only take about 20 minutes. And I explained to him that I couldn't leave my students, that I had an obligation to stay with them while they were taking the exam. Well, he argued with me. He kept trying to tell me that there was nothing wrong with my leaving my students, and how he really wanted me to see the Endeavour, and how it wouldn't take very long. And I could tell that he was agitated. He kept wringing his hands and shifting from one side to the other. And I could tell that he was extremely upset that I wouldn't go with him to see the shuttle, but I didn't, nevertheless. And I went back home, got off the base okay. The next day, though, there was an article in our local newspaper that said that armed guards were stationed around the shuttle with authorization to use deadly force. And I earnestly believe that deadly force was meant for me, that I was supposed to have gone out to the shuttle, I was supposed to have gotten extremely close to it, I was supposed to have taken pictures, and I was supposed to have been killed. My curiosity far outweighed my fear, and I continued with my hypnosis sessions, and I continued seeking out the answers to the questions of this phenomenon. And as a result, I've met many other abductees. I've met a whole lot of other researchers, and many of them have asked me, why do you feel that you've undergone harassment? Why do you feel that the military and government have singled you out like this? A lot of researchers and abductees say that they have not encountered military government harassment in their cases or in other cases, so why have I? Well, one possible explanation is that I was involved in a crash of a spaceship. I remember being aboard a craft, aboard a spaceship, and I remember looking out the porthole onto the ocean below. I'm not 100% positive where this took place, but I have an idea. Anyway, I was looking out the porthole and I saw a military ship on the ocean below, and while I was looking at it, I felt a jolt, and I remember falling backwards and hitting my head on something. And the next thing I recalled was waking up and walking out an opening of the craft onto a beach, sandy area, and I remember hearing airplanes and helicopters overhead, and I remembered seeing a man with an alien creature over his shoulder. I remembered seeing a lifeboat approach the shore, and two men motioned for me to come aboard that lifeboat. Before that happened, I remembered when I walked out onto the beach toward the water, I remembered somebody yelling at me to stay where I was. Somebody said, "Stay right there, don't move." The sound sounded amplified to me. I don't know now if it was because my head was hurting so bad, feeling as if it were going to explode, or if there was some kind of megaphone or something like that amplifying the sound. I remember getting into the lifeboat, not struggling, but going with two men in the lifeboat out to the big military ship. And I remember hearing helicopters overhead as I was going out onto the ocean. And once I climbed up into the ship, climbed up a ladder onto the ship, and once I got on deck, I remember a man in uniform helping me onto the deck. And once I got up there, I saw one alien still alive lying on the deck of the ship. I don't know whether this was the same alien that I saw earlier on the beach or not, but there are several aliens that are unaccounted for in my mind. I don't know what happened to them. I know that there were at least 4 aliens aboard the craft with me, and I saw 1 or 2 after the crash. I don't know what happened to the others. I remembered wanting to help this entity that was still alive, and 2 men grabbed me and took me down some stairs onto a lower deck of the ship. And the last thing I remember was sitting down on the bottom stair, and my head felt so heavy and hurt so badly. I felt it was going to explode, and I felt like I was going to pass out. And the last thing I remember was sitting down on the stair and putting my head in my lap, and I don't remember anything else. Another memory I have is of 2 men escorting me from a military plane into a car and taking me back to a motel where I was staying and holding me. One man held me at gunpoint while the other one went to a desk to get a key to my room. And I remember being kept out in the hallway at gunpoint by one man while the other one went inside my room where my husband was supposed to be sleeping. I assume that that's how I got back from the crash site, although there's a big gap in memory. In September of 1992, I decided to try to find the crash site where it possibly occurred. I think it's possible that it occurred in the Gulf Breeze area around Navarre Beach. I'm not positive. I have reason to believe that's where it took place, but I can't be sure. I do know that the area down there is consistent with what I remembered in my hypnosis session. Anyway, I decided to walk one day from Navarre Beach to Fort Walton Beach to see if the area did look consistent with the crash site, and it did. And that portion of beach where I walked is right at the border of Eglin Air Force Base. About halfway through my walk, I saw some equipment that has since been confirmed as being an electromagnetic pulse device. Some of the researchers who worked on my case believe that this electromagnetic pulse device was responsible for downing the craft that I was in when the crash occurred. I've experienced what I consider some extreme forms of harassment by military government officials. At least I believe they're military and government officials. I can't prove it. For instance, I had an encounter one night. I was abducted by the chalky-colored creatures, and their normal medical experiments were performed on me. But they didn't bring me all the way home that night. Instead, what they did was drop me off in a field near my home. I remember being somewhat programmed. I felt as if I were in some kind of a zombie state, and I remember thinking to myself as I was looking up into the sky, I've got to get back home. I've got to get back home. And while I was standing out in the field thinking about that, as if I were programmed, a helicopter landed in front of me. And so a bunch of men wearing green fatigues and carrying big black machine guns jumped out of the helicopter and came up to me and grabbed me. And I started yelling expletives at them as soon as I realized what was going on, and struggled with them, but to no avail. And they dragged me into the helicopter, and as I approached the helicopter, I saw a man wearing Air Force Blue uniform. He seemed to be the one in charge of the situation. I remember him telling me that I was a troublemaker and they were going to have to shut me up. And this was about the point in time that I had decided I was going to undergo hypnotic regression to recover my memories. Anyway, I was taken aboard the helicopter. It seemed that we flew a short distance, and the helicopter landed near a building that had restricted on the door. And I was shoved inside, and as soon as I got inside the door, the man in the Air Force Blue uniform said to a group of men who were apparently waiting for me to arrive, "Here she is. She's a cocky little bitch." And there was a man in a khaki uniform standing at the opposite side of the room, and he looked at me coldly and said, "Well, we'll just take care of that." And they did. The next thing I remembered was someone giving me a shot in my right arm, and I remembered becoming very dizzy and feeling as if I were going to pass out. I remember being shoved into a chair, and I remember asking the man in the khaki uniform what they wanted with me, what I was doing there, what they wanted. And he told me, quoting, "It's none of your damn business, just shut up and listen." I told him I wasn't ready to listen, that I wanted an explanation for why I was there, and I didn't get one. He told me, I just remember him telling me that I had not seen a spaceship. He kept telling me over and over again, "You did not see a spaceship. Do you understand? You did not see a spaceship." And I argued with him. I said, "I know what I saw. What are you trying to cover up?" And again, he said, "It's none of your damn business." Interestingly, he didn't say we're not trying to cover up anything. He just told me it was none of my business. I don't remember much after that. I remember getting very dizzy, very weak, putting my head down, and I remember at one point being put on a stretcher, being put in the back of a truck, and I had my eyes closed, and I heard one man say to another, how are we going to handle this? And I heard another man reply, I don't know, this is a tough one. When I remembered this encounter, I was very upset. I felt that my rights had been violated. I was very upset at being drugged against my will, being taken off to a base and questioned and being brainwashed and not remembering everything that happened to me. And I felt that I had a right to know what was going on, and yet I was given no information. That's only one incident that I've had with apparent military government people. I remembered being in what I believed to be a military hospital. Again, I saw men in uniform and men in white lab coats. I recall being given shots. I remember being strapped down. I remember being given shock treatment. And again, I was told that I had caused these people trouble. I don't know what kind of trouble I've caused, so I'm exasperated about not knowing what they're talking about. They've wiped too much memory from my mind. I've also recalled these apparent military government people in this military hospital. I've also recalled them using an X-ray to X-ray my body. And I remember being in some kind of a transparent container. I don't know what they were doing with me there or what was happening to me. I do know that my ear hurt when I was in this facility, my right ear, the one that I had recalled the aliens messing with earlier. And I do know that after this encounter, I no longer heard some Morse code type beeps in my right ear that I had been hearing previously. I assume that these individuals removed something from my ear that had been causing tones, but I'm not sure. I don't know for certain that's what happened. I also recalled receiving shock treatment when I was in a hillside facility with a tiny little entity about the height of the knees of a man, and the man in green fatigues was standing there questioning him. I remember getting shock treatment then and being asked what happens when you're on board spacecraft. I've remembered seeing various types of entities. One type is what I call chalky colored creatures. These are the ones who performed the medical experiments on me. They are between 4 and 5 feet tall. They have big black almond-shaped eyes, no whites, no pupils. They have 4 fingers. I don't remember what their feet look like. I don't recall ever seeing any ears, no hair, 2 little holes for a nose. They move so gracefully, extremely gracefully, and they talk. They communicate telepathically through the eyes. I have also seen a creature that I call the reptilian. I remember encountering that creature only one time. It was a rape encounter. This creature was the ugliest creature I could ever imagine seeing. He had scaly skin and long claws. His head reminded me of a snake's head in its shape. He had long pointed ears. He was probably around 5.5 feet tall. Had kind of tan or brownish skin, and it looked like protrusions, sort of, in up here in the chest area, although my memory is quite vague. In that encounter, I couldn't move. I was paralyzed. I didn't have any feeling, and I don't remember too much about that encounter other than what I'm reporting now. Beginning in May 1991, I started receiving telepathic communications from some unknown source. The first time I received any communication of this sort was after one of my hypnosis sessions, where I remembered being interrogated in a conference room on base. And the telepathic communication I received that time was in the form of symbols. The symbols seemed to be religious symbols, but I was extremely confused after I saw these symbols in my head. It was, to describe it, it's very difficult, but the best way I can explain it is by saying if a person imagines just scrolling down a computer screen and seeing one symbol on each screen, that's what I saw, but in my head, in my mind. Nothing had ever happened to me like that before. It happened after I prayed. After my hypnosis session, I was so upset. I didn't understand what was going on as far as the alien phenomenon was concerned. I didn't understand why our military and government were trying to cover it up, and I certainly didn't understand why I was caught in the middle. It was before I remembered being involved in the crash, and so I didn't know at that point in time why I might be singled out by military and government officials. So I was extremely upset, and I was praying to God to give me answers to these questions that I had. And I was begging for God to help me understand what was going on. You know, why were these aliens interested in me? Why were the military and government officials interested in me? And what was happening? What did the phenomenon mean? And I was begging for answers. And that's when I first saw symbols scrolling through my head. I don't understand what they mean. Even to this day, I don't know what they mean, but they did give me a source of comfort, and I was able to go to sleep. So some of my telepathic communications have come in the form of symbols. There was another time that I had a dream of symbols, but again, I don't remember what the symbols meant or why they were in my head. I've also received verbal telepathic communications, although not audible. I don't hear a voice. I call the communications the silent voice because I don't really hear anything. I just have instant knowledge in my head. Some of the communications of this nature I've received involve spiritual type things. For instance, one night I was asleep and something awakened me, and I sat up in bed, and then all of a sudden got a lot of information about what this silent voice called the spiritual grid of the universe. And the message there was that we live in different eras, and the era we live in now is about to end, and a new era is about to begin. And I was told that people who are in tune with this awakening would be given the opportunity to go to a higher spiritual level if they want to. I was told that everything that we do basically is because we choose to do so. We have freedom of choice in all things. And I was told that if we choose to stay on the same spiritual level we're on now, we can do that. But the way to progress from one level to another is by heeding our positive and negative, or heeding our positive energies rather than our negative ones. So that's one communication I have received. I've also been told specific things that would help me. For instance, I've been taught by the silent voice not to give in to anger, fear, worry, and guilt, that they create mind noise. And by mind noise, what the silent voice meant was that if we dwell on these negative characteristics, and then our thoughts about our fears and worries, they fill our mind and they prevent us from doing constructive things. So we've got to learn how to not worry or be afraid or be filled with anger or filled with guilt. I've also been told that time is not linear, that really time is non-existent, that time is like a slinky, that it can overlap, it can contract, expand, overlap, and that there can even be more than one slinky, in other words, more than one dimension, and these dimensions can overlap, intertwine. I've been told that there's going to be a period of devastation that will arrive soon, and I've been told that I need to get my body in good shape, exercise, eat right. I don't know why, but I was told to do those things. I was also given a telepathic message to write a children's book about an abduction. One night, about 11:30 p.m., I was just brushing my teeth, minding my own business, not even thinking about the UFO phenomenon, and the silent voice told me to take an encounter I had when I was 3 years old and write it into a story in the form of a children's book for preschoolers, so that children who are being abducted would not be so afraid. I was told that this story was to be written to help alleviate the fear of young children who are being abducted. So I think all in all, the telepathic communications I've received have benefited me. I don't see that they've harmed me in any way, at least so far. I don't know whether what I'm told is true or not. I don't know whether where these messages are coming from. When I receive these messages, I don't see anything. So I don't know whether or not these messages can be trusted. I just feel that they're important enough to discuss and let whoever hears them make up his or her own mind about what to think of them. I've seen a big transformation in my personality since the time I started remembering my encounters and the present time. When I first started remembering my encounters, of course I wanted to be diagnosed as crazy at first so I could be cured and my memories could just be put away. Once I realized that my abduction encounters were real, really happened, were true, I had a very difficult time coping. At first, I went through denial and shock. Oh, I was angry too. I wasn't angry that my abductions were occurring. I was angry that my memory of them was being wiped from my mind. I was angry that entities would come into my house during the night and take me away and bring me back and not allow me to remember it. My anger was pointed at not knowing what was happening to me and why. After I realized I was being followed by apparent military government people, and after I was taken to a base and interrogated and given shock treatment and drugged up by these apparent military and government officials, again, I was just horribly filled with anger. I felt betrayed by our military and government. I felt that my rights had been violated. I felt that all my privacy had been stripped away. I felt like a little hunted animal that couldn't escape. And I was filled with fear that I was going to be killed. So I had a very, very difficult time coping. I've had a lot of time to work through all these feelings. The silent voice helped me work through anger and fear. Once I was told that I mustn't dwell on anger and fear and worry and guilt, it took a while, but I learned the truth of those messages. I learned that they didn't help me. These negative emotions didn't help me. Of course, there are still some times when I backslide, and I'll maybe have an encounter and wake up with marks on my body, won't remember how I got them, and that's extremely frustrating. And recently, I remember being deprogrammed by apparent military government officials, having my memory erased, and I became very upset with that. So I still face these challenges that are difficult to deal with and hard to cope with, but there are things that I do for myself that help me cope. First thing, I have to remind myself that I'm human, and I just can't be cheerful and happy all the time, so I allow myself the luxury of being depressed every once in a while. Sometimes I cry. Sometimes if I get extremely depressed, I'll even watch a sad movie or something like that to make myself cry, so I can get the emotions out. I realize that the worst thing I can do is keep everything bottled up inside. If I keep everything bottled up inside, it eats at me, and my chest hurts or my stomach hurts, and it starts affecting me physically, or I get so upset I can't eat. So I've found that it's best for me to do something to get the feelings out. I talk to other abductees and other researchers. That has helped me tremendously, knowing that I'm not alone in all of this, knowing that these things do happen to other people, that people I've never heard of before, never met before, or whose stories I've never heard, and experience the same things I experience, and that's confirmation for me. And the more confirmation I get, the easier it is for me to deal with my encounters. Sometimes I just have to get totally away from the UFO phenomenon for a while. Sometimes I have to escape for a few days where I don't talk to any abductees or researchers, or answer my mail or answer my phone, and try not to even think about the UFO phenomenon at all, to clear my head. It helps me to get outside, to get out with nature and to rediscover what God created. That helps me to cope sometimes too. And I make a point of doing things that I enjoy, so that I can escape from the memories for a while. A lot of people ask me how I'm able to cope with this abductee status so well. But what they don't know, because they don't see it, is that I don't always deal with it so well. You know, there's still so many things that happen to me that I still have trouble coping with. And I have my friends and other people to support me, and I pray a lot. I pray to God, but you know, all we can do is just do the best we can, and that's all we can ask of ourselves. Many people ask me what my opinion is of what's going on here. You know, what's this phenomenon all about? And of course, I don't have the answer to that question. I wish I did. Right now, based on my own experiences, my own encounters, the telepathic messages I've received, military government harassment, my opinion at present is that there's a struggle going on between good and evil, and we're caught up in the middle of it. I've heard so many abductees talk about their encounters that seem to have a negative slant, and others seem to have a positive slant. And I believe that we're caught up in a war between maybe dark forces and light forces, good and evil, whatever we want to call it. But until I get further evidence, that's what I tend to believe. I always like to say that the one thing that is very important to me is that everyone keep an open mind. When I first learned about this abduction phenomenon, I was a Southern Baptist certified public accountant teaching in a very traditional environment. I knew nothing about the UFO phenomenon at that time, and I've had to open my mind a lot, a whole lot. I've had to expand my reality considerably, and I've discovered that our universe is so much larger than what I had ever imagined it being. And the one thing that I request, it really doesn't matter to me whether someone believes me or not. It doesn't matter to me. All I ask is that everyone keep an open mind.